Despite the restrictions imposed on slaves, free people of color began to amass considerable wealth and power in the 1750s. Several hundred became wealthy planters and merchants, and some even had slaves of their own. Many others served in the colonial militia, the Mare Chasse, a local police force created to control the growing slave population. Many whites were concerned about the growing status of a franchise. So this is the quote I was just talking about. The men are beginning to fill the colony, and it is of the greatest perversion to see them, their numbers continually increasing among the whites, with fortunes often greater than those of the whites. These coloreds imitate the style of the whites and try to wipe out all memory of their original state. And this was put out by the colonial administrators, the French officials in 1750. Again, it's just showing that they're afraid and fearful, and they're not happy for these people. They're trying to put them down again, and they're free people. How did the colonial authorities try to control St. Dominique's people of color? So this is getting into the next question, which is lists 4 provisions of the Black Code. So this is how they're going to try to control them. By the time the revolution began in 1791, there were approximately 32,000 whites, 28,000 affranchis, and 500,000 enslaved people in the colony. Again, this is foreshadowing of how it's all going to make a difference in the revolution. In order to control St. Dominique's people of color, white planters and administrators created a highly structured, repressive society. So now they're getting really into structure, and they're going to try to hold people of color down. In 1685, France's King Louis XIV issued the Code Noir, or Black Code, which was a set of codes that outlined France's position on slavery in the colonies. The code established that slaves were the personal property of their masters. It also put strict limits on the behavior of slaves. For example, forbidding them to assemble for any reason, including marriage, ceremonies, or dances. So they said, that's it, no getting together for marriages, no ceremonies, no dances. They're getting so strict with them. They were enforced by violent punishments. Fugitive slaves, which were slaves that would run away, the ones who were caught after they run away, could have their ears cut off, be hamstrung, which was a method of crippling by severing or cutting leg muscles, or they could be killed. Free blacks discovered to have helped slaves. So if you were a free black living on the island, you helped a slave and they found out, you could lose your freedom. The code also gave planters the right to shoot on sight anyone they thought to be a fugitive, resulting in the deaths of many. So this is, I think, really important because it says, oh, well, if you just think they're a fugitive, you can shoot and kill them. So no questions, nothing, just shoot and kill. And how does codes like this affect us today? At the time, the code created some protections for slaves and outlined minimum standards for their treatment. For example, the code dictated the minimum amount of food that owners or overseers had to provide for their slaves and set the maximum hours of work. It also put limits on the brutality that owners could use against their slaves. But in practice, the protections of the code were not enforced, and the treatment of slaves was at the discretion of the owners and overseers. Most slaves were underfed, undernourished, and overworked. Sometimes plantation had as many as 200 or 300 slaves and only a handful of whites. Many planters used violence and terror to control their slaves and motivate them to work. They used a variety of brutal punishments, for example, burning slaves in ovens, pouring boiling cane sugar over their heads, or putting salt, pepper, or lemon in wounds that they had left by whippings. Here's a quote. "It is the feeling of absolute power the master holds over the slave's person that prevents them from stabbing the master to death. Remove this break and the slave will attempt anything." This was a coffee planter in the North Plain. They knew if you hurt these people, they will rebel. And that's what these people were doing, so brutally hurting these slaves. The abuses and violent excesses of planters were so bad that in 1784, the French government reissued many of the provisions of the Code Noir to provide further protection for slaves. But there was little that enslaved people could do to protect their rights. The local government rarely intervened in cases of planter abuse, and the word of slave against his or her own master was not considered legal testimony in court. So even if the slave went to court and said, "I'm going to tell you exactly what happened and I'll go under oath and promise to tell the truth," they said, "No, your testimony doesn't count. You're just a slave." So I just want to show you the provisions for the Black Code. Even though it's asking you to list 4, list all 5 of these because it's really important. So you can pause the video and write those down. And the next question that we're looking for is the importance of voodoo. So we're going to look for that, and we're going to list for ways that the enslaved people resisted their owners. So whites also attempted to control the population of free people of color. Many felt that white dominance in the colony was threatened by successful affranchise. Remember that. In the 1760s, the colonial government issued decrees designed to limit the ambitions of affranchise. So now they're putting limits even on free people just because of the color of their skin, and prevent their becoming too much like whites. As a result, the affranchise found that they were stripped of many of the freedoms and privileges that they had once enjoyed. New laws forbid them from sitting with or dressing like whites, holding public office, practicing privileged trades such as law or medicine, and assembling in public after 9 p.m. These offenses were punishable with fines, imprisonment, loss of freedom, or amputation of limbs. So they're getting so strict, and this is going to break. How did enslaved people resist slavery? So they were put under so much pressure, but you'll see they find ways to kind of say, screw you, and they do things, and voodoo is one of those, which we'll talk about. So some historians have pointed out that there were far fewer organized slave rebellions in St. Dominique than in nearby colonies. There really weren't that many rebellions compared to the other places. And many people find this surprising, considering that eventually when they did revolt, they won. Scholars have attributed this relative lack of revolts to a number of different factors, including the diversity of the enslaved community and the military strength of St. Dominique's colonial government.